Hello, Monique. Thank you. Thank you for coming, and the floor is straight away yours.
Thank you very much. Okay, this morning I am unfortunately unable to have my co-presenter with us because he, for COVID reasons, has to suddenly have an international flight. So unfortunately, I get to do this myself. And he normally has a lot of really great insights to this. So that's a bit of a pity, but we will go ahead. The two of us have been working, Pierre Siklos and I, on inflation expectations surveys for many years together. And we've also been doing work on central bank communication and how the two of these interact. And at the last while, we've been using the BR's inflation expectations surveys, specifically using disaggregated data, focusing on firm level data, which has been really interesting and giving us some new insights. So this is the data that we continue with in this paper. In previous, more recent work that we've done, we have used the data to have a look at how these survey respondents think about economic relationships, such as the Phillips curve. But in this paper, we turn now specifically to disagreement between the forecasters in the survey. Specifically, what we aim to do in this paper is to, first of all, learn more about this data set, which we believe is really underutilized. Given how much information it has, it really is a rich data set in that they ask questions not only about what forecasters believe about inflation, but also what they believe about some of the other relevant macroeconomic variables, such as forecasts of GDP and interest rate forecasts, things like this. We've also done work on the disaggregated data about the household level data, which we just mentioned here as well. So at times in the paper, we're able to compare some of those results as well. But the focus in this paper is on the firm level data. Another aim that we have in the paper is specifically to now have a look at different types and levels of disagreement. So in other words, we want to have a look at the fact that we can look at different horizons. So in the survey, the survey respondents are asked to forecast for the current year's inflation, as well as the year ahead, 2 years ahead, and 5 years ahead more recently. But we're also able to think about the ways that we aggregate data. So this could make a difference. For example, if you look at the disaggregated data of the three groups in the BR survey, the business sector is quite a large sample relative to the others. The financial analysts and the survey of the trade unions are much smaller numbers. So sometimes people treat each observation equally, in which case the weighting of the business sector, for example, goes up, whereas some other people will take the average of each of those groups and then put them together, which in essence means that they're weighting the views of, for example, the financial analysts and the trade unions quite heavily compared, depending on your views of whether that's the right way to weight it. But our point is that the way that we aggregate things could make a difference. So we think about the different ways of aggregating and a little bit about the level. So so for example, there's times where it makes sense to look at the level because monetary policy has to be, you've got one instrument. So you've got to think about the aggregates sometimes. But when you're thinking about communicating to different audiences, then it might make sense to have a better understanding of what different groups within this average are actually doing. So we consider these type of things. And a third contribution is that we have some of the data at the beginning of the COVID crisis, so we can start to see what impact that is having on inflation expectations. So a little bit more, starting with this data set. I won't spend a huge amount of time describing the data set, only because a lot of people in the audience have heard me do this in previous presentations, but just perhaps a few things. First of all, the literature generally has focused more on the inflation expectations of professional forecasters. In South Africa's case, we call them financial analysts because they aren't specifically all professional forecasters in that sense, but they are the people that spend their days focusing on this kind of data, so they know it well. Another part of the literature has increasingly focused on household forecasts, which is important because of our view that increasingly we're interested in what the general public believes about expectations and about future inflation. But there is a lot of interest in what firms believe, if we believe that they are in fact an important representative of where price pressures come from. And one of the main reasons that there is so little work on this is simply because the data doesn't exist. And in South Africa, we really do have such a data set. It's one of the only data sets that's been running for as long as it has. So since the advent of inflation targeting. So we have 20 plus years of data at a quarterly frequency. And as we've said before, not only are they forecasting, asking for forecasts of inflation, they're also asking about other macroeconomic variables and at a range of horizons, which is obviously very important. As we'll show you today, these expectations do differ quite a bit at different horizons. And as we've said now, the disaggregated data is really important. And it will, the level at which and the type of aggregation you use really should depend on the question, whether you're looking at communication or the setting of the interest rate, which is a single instrument. Just a little bit about the literature. So first of all, it's quite a large literature on forecast disagreement and the sources of this disagreement. And so I do send you to, if you want to read a bit more about this, to a recent survey by my collaborator, Pierre Siklos, in 2009. But basically what I will say is that there are multiple theories about what causes this disagreement. And the results are mixed for a number of the sort of areas of interest still. But the relationship, some of the things that have become very important in the literature is the relationship between forecast disagreement and uncertainty, for example. So there are different kinds of results, but basically a lot of the literature is starting to believe that disagreement, that uncertainty is one component of disagreement. It could be one of the reasons for disagreement, but many people believe it's not a perfect proxy. However, some researchers are suggesting, for example, that if there are large movements in disagreement, then that large and sudden movements, that those probably capture uncertainty, for example. Another part of the literature would still be focusing on the traditional focus on whether forecasts really are accurate and efficient. However, there's a group that are focusing less on just the forecasting and more on whether the forecasts that are there, so the survey respondents of each group, whether their forecasts are in fact consistent with economic theory, so whether they have a traditional Phillips curve reasoning, for example, and whether they understand monetary policy. So this again we expect, as you would expect, we find results that are different for the households versus professional forecasters. We found that forecasters or financial analysts are more likely to have expectations that are more in line with economic theory, and they have a better understanding of monetary policy. But there is literature for the US that finds that increased transparency and central bank communication narrows the gap between these two, which would be encouraging for inflation targeters, of course. There's also literature that asks how sensitive inflation expectations are to different forms of information. The first being, the sensitivity to macroeconomic news, suggesting a better anchoring. But there's also obviously literatures about the herding amongst analysts. So now we're talking about different types of news. So for example, you could move on from this kind of discussion into whether communication itself is a form of news that influences expectations in a positive way. And on this note, we again say that there's mixed results really in terms of where the communication and transparency itself has decreased disagreement or improved it. So the idea would be that there is reason to believe that sometimes when you increase communication, because there's more information available, this might in some senses increase the disagreement. There is a question, however, about whether the negative results about transparency have something to do with how we measure inflation targeting, because obviously there's heterogeneity across inflation targeters. And so if you use a binary variable in your regression, for example, you just say they're definitely inflation targeters if they announce the target, and so they get a dummy variable of 1. They would be, this inflation targeter would be treated the same as another. And it might be that that doesn't clearly show us the differences in transparency. So there's still some disagreement about that. What I do want to mention just at the end of the literature part is that this literature generally assumes that inflation expectations matter for policy. And there is a recent paper by Reid that questions the usefulness of inflation expectations. What we want to sort of emphasize here is that, first of all, we're not taking a specific stand on this in this paper. But we do want to point out that Reid is actually focusing more on the relevance of long-term expectations. It's much harder to argue that expectations at the short run do not matter for monetary policy. We find that they are much more fragile, and they can't easily be divorced from macrofinance variables. So we just want to mention that. Then moving on from the theory itself, we also want to acknowledge that there are a number of ways of actually measuring disagreement. So there's not a universally agreed upon measure. The ways generally include, for example, the interquartile range, which would have been the original paper by Mankiw and Rice and Wolfers. But there's also a range of different measures of forecast dispersion. And we follow this kind of measure. Specifically, the one that we use is we retain all the information. So we retain also the outliers. Part of the reason that we're not worried about doing that over here is that we are working with firm level data, so there simply are fewer of these outliers. When we worked with household data before, there were plenty of extreme cases in both directions, actually. But in the case of the specialists and the businesses, we found far fewer of these. And when peer tested, for the sensitivity to this, he didn't find that it was making any big difference. So we choose to retain all the information. Then we move on in the paper from then. Once we've thought about how to measure it, we move on to thinking about the determinants of disagreement. So what do we find in terms of what is causing this disagreement? I've put only parts of the table here. We have quite a large table in the paper, and what I've got here is sort of half of it. So we look at the sources of disagreement here. Specifically, we're only focusing on inflation disagreement. Of course, we could look at disagreement in all of the variables, but this is quite a large task. So for this paper, we're focusing on disagreement about inflation, which could be influenced by the other variables. So we have in these regressions, we have included the other forecasts. So the first variables would be the respondents' forecasts about consumer price index, about GDP, the prime interest rate, wages, M3, so the money supply, the Rand exchange rate. And then near the bottom, you'll see similar variables, but with a lag. So these would be observed variables. So we decided to include what they could observe at the time. And in terms of the columns now, the first three columns, we have the forecasts from the business sector, the financial analysts, and labor. So the three groups, although we are focusing primarily on the business sector, we allow you to compare them. These gray columns are for the current year. So these are their forecasts of inflation for the current year. And then in the table in the paper, we would have the year ahead forecasts as well, and 2-year ahead forecasts. And then we have our final blue columns here, which is the 5-year ahead. So we're just showing you the very short forecasts and the very long ones so that they're easier to look at on the slide. There's a few things we noticed. First of all, the long run expectations react to different variables to what the short run do. So they are different. They rely primarily on different types of information, slightly different. The different groups also respond to different determinants. We noticed that only the businesses display consistent interest or rely consistently on some of the forward-looking variables. So there are other forecasts of the Rand, the prime interest rates, and wages. They're economically significant, and they're the only ones that are doing this consistently. So this is interesting in that, generally in the literature, when we've looked at these groups in South Africa, we find that only the financial analysts are more rational. But in this sense of being forward-looking, it is the business sector that are consistently looking at their own, understand it's their own forecasts of these variables, but they are at least incorporating them, which is very interesting to us. And in the long run, this changes slightly, and we find that if you look at the business sector in the 5-year horizon, that they are then relying on past values a lot more than they did in the beginning. So yes, we don't see, although you can see some similarities in the others, they are, the business sector's behavior does differ from the others. So this is interesting. For example, the financial analysts in the short run are relying more on bond rates. The R153 is the government bond rate, much more than what a business sector would, for example. We then also look at disagreement. We just want to show this diagram here again at the short run. The first diagram is the short run inflation forecast of the three groups, the black line being business sector, the blue line being the financial analysts, and the red one being the trade unions. You can see there at the short run that the trade unions appear to react very strongly to the global financial crisis. Generally, if you look at all of the forecasts, they show more volatility, more disagreement at the start of inflation targeting. It seems to die down quite substantially after the crisis. Before the global financial crisis, we're also seeing the impact of the the exchange rate crisis that we had in 2002, 2003. At first, I was a little surprised by the second sort of increase over there in between 2004 and 2006, because this was a very stable period in terms of inflation rate. But when talking to people from the Bureau that have been watching this for many years, they did point out to me that many forecasters were actually very surprised at the fact that the rand had improved so much over the time, that it strengthened so much. So inflation was in fact surprising on the downside quite a lot during that period. And for example, if you have a look, it was the inflation, the actual inflation was coming in at 35-year lows. So it is true that there could be quite a bit of disagreement, even though the actual inflation was looking very stable. And then, yes, after the crisis, the disagreement decreases a lot. We note over here that the global financial crisis seems to really have a dominating role, but when we look at this data differently just now, you'll see that this extreme result seems to be less significant later. When we look on the other side of the diagram now, we have the longer term forecast. Again, so first of all, obviously the axis has very different numbers, so it looks more extreme on the side than what it should, right? So it's not as dramatic as it looks. Again, we see that there is a period when the expectations of the labor stand out. This is a period where we were experiencing quite serious strike action in the gold market. So that's what we think we're seeing over there. I think the only other thing to note is, that the blue line is the financial analysts. As normal, they are a little bit more anchored than the others. And then we move on here to looking at up to now, we've been looking at the aggregate numbers. So now we start to look more at the disaggregated numbers. We're able from the survey to look at different, look at firms according to different criteria. So over here, what we've done is we're showing you the data according to the size of the firm. So the top line is showing you the micro-sized firms, and then the blue is small firms, and red medium, and the green is the large firms. So we find that they seem to have a very similar pattern, but on average, we're finding that the smaller firms show a higher level of disagreement. At the bottom, what we're also able to do with the data is have a look at each survey, the survey respondent who is responding on behalf of the business would state their position in the business. So you'd be able to see, for example, what we're showing you here. One of the diagrams is this is the responses specifically of those respondents that claim that they are the CEO of the company. It's interesting to us that they seem to respond a little bit quicker to the COVID pandemic. They start showing a bit more volatility there. Of course, we can only see the beginning of pandemic over there. Again, we can see the global financial crisis, the impact of that over here as well. The final thing that we do in the paper is to consider the data using factor model approach to try and look at the data in a different way. So to have a look at salient information across the different forms of data we have. And it's in this model that we notice, if we look at the data in this way, that we're seeing the impact of the pandemic much more sharply than before. The top diagram, we are looking at all of the data together, but at different horizons. And in the bottom figure, we're looking at only the business sector data. And yes, the one at the bottom is surprising to me. So we're not seeing, so first of all, we can see we cannot look at the 5-year ahead forecast for the whole period, because unfortunately that question we only started asking it in the survey from about 2012. So unfortunately you can't see the global financial crisis, but you can see that it's coming down there quite a bit. In the data, we also see that they're responding to the crisis much more at the long horizon than at the short horizon, which is, yeah, I'm not quite sure why that is yet. I can't, unfortunately, what we can't do yet is explain anything that isn't obviously explainable from the variables that we have, so the other forecast variables. But so there's a lot more that we need to ask, obviously, as to why there are these differences, but we do see differences. And so what we do at least want to say is that we really do think that it's important that more of us be able to use this disaggregated data, to spend time with trying to understand it. And we're very grateful that it is more available than it has been previously. Just in terms of summarizing our findings, we feel that our findings reveal that when forecasters disagree about the future, this is partly because they also disagree about the future course of other key macro and finance variables. So in other words, the other variables that they were forecasting seem to matter. Certainly for the business sector, this is particularly strong. It also matters what their previous forecasts were. So in other words, there is a persistence. The sources of disagreement can be highly sensitive to the level of aggregation, and also to the horizons, again, which is linking to the previous point. When we combine all the variables being forecast that we are able to see, the forecasters responded sharply in early 2002 as the pandemic emerged. So when we use the factor models, we're still asking ourselves the question of whether it's inattention to differences in what the past, teaches us, and certain economic characteristics, and whether it's biases. We can't yet answer what is causing, the people to pay more attention to one or the other. So we can't yet say, for example, if it's inattention to the information. But most importantly, what the results do point to is the value that is added by looking at the disaggregated data. For example, we would like to spend a lot more time trying to understand how different industries are responding. We see some evidence that, for example, which we haven't shown a lot of here, that some industries would be more sensitive, for example, to the exchange rates than others. So we have a bit of information about this as well. So that is obviously an area where we think ourselves and others that are interested should be spending more time to understand the behavior that underlies the differences. Yes, and that's what we have to show at this point.
Monique, thank you very much, and great paper, great work. Thank you. And we'll definitely need to look more at this detailed analysis. Very interesting. I start myself asking a question. The table you show, you are regressing this index of disagreement on the actual, therefore the way I should interpret it is, how do I interpret the significance? That because you have information from or different judgment about the repo determine different judgment about the inflation, or different. What is you are regressing? So disagreement about the exchange rate on disagreement about inflation.
It's a pity I didn't put the exact equation there, but yes. So the first variables are showing you disagreement about the about the different forecasts. So the first ones are their forecasts of, yes, and the dependent variable is the disagreement in inflation. So if they are disagreeing, they have different views of what, how the economy is evolving, then this increases the likelihood that they disagree about inflation. And the lagged variables are their previous forecast. So this would be the things that they can observe at the time. Yes, the information that they,
But that's what I don't understand. But the lag value instead is the actual value or disagreement about the past?
I understand what you're asking now. Now, this is exactly where I had seen it as the lagged value of their own past
forecast.
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
Now,
yes,
it's a pity Pierre is not here to say for sure. Let's put this in, but this is how I've been understanding. So their own forecast. So yes.
In some sense, there is an autocorrelation in the disagreement about the forecast of the variable. But then it's surprising why this autocorrelation doesn't persist in the long run. Therefore, for the long run, you have disagreement on total different stuff.
Yes. Well, so they do it for some of the variables, but not for all of them. Not in an economic or not in a significant way. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I must go back and ask Pierre to check whether I'm in that.
We have Rangan after Gideon with questions. Rangan, you can go ahead.
Yes. Hi, Monique. Can you hear me?
Hello. Yes, I can.
No, thanks for the presentation. It was quite interesting. I've always, I know this literature, the current one with Barbara Rossi doing a lot of work on this, the forecasted disagreement as measuring uncertainty. But there is also this literature on financial markets on herding, you know. And what is interesting with the herding literature, it tends to show that when there is more uncertainty, markets tend to herd. You know, so it's always agents in the market or the participants are herding more when there is higher uncertainty. So it's weird to see, in some sense, it's contradictory that forecasted disagreements are higher when actually uncertainty is higher. To me, I always thought it would, you see that. So in some sense, it might be that that people are using different information sets or how to come about their forecasts. So it's always something that seems contradictory to me, but I know that you do see this wide forecasted disagreements during uncertain periods. So
it's a good point. I wonder whether the same kind of behavior can be seen when you're. So of course, there's differences again in what the business sector is doing versus the financial analyst. So maybe it's just that the herding is.
The big volatilities that you see with the labor unions. I sometimes always feel that that some amount of answering to the survey question is based on some kind of modeling decisions by the more sophisticated agents who are financial analysts and business analysts, and the labor unions go more with I don't know what here we don't necessarily know. They probably go more with their gut feeling, and you see these massive volatilities.
So if I'm very honest, the labor part of the survey I have always had the least confidence in, and there's a few reasons. So first of all, just the number of respondents in that survey is much, much smaller than in businesses. It's also, I think, the drivers of their behavior, as you correctly point out, are more complex. So I sometimes think that the way they answer the survey might be different to how they negotiate, because in the survey, you're asking them what they believe inflation is. And it might be that their forecast of inflation is quite reasonable. But when they speak in the media or negotiate, they have a different agenda, right? It's a strategic agenda, and it isn't just tied to inflation. So I do think that sometimes the information we get there is a bit difficult to disentangle. And the third thing, which is just sort of a operational thing that I've learned through speaking to George Kassoff, who has administered this survey for the BER for 2 decades, is that when you have a look at who answers the survey for the trade unions, it is more difficult to disentangle whether the person who actually receives physically the survey and answers it is a shop steward or who they are in the organization, and whether they're really the person that will be doing the negotiating. And so it's a difficult survey, given that you've got often, a small number of respondents and you're not quite sure if they're exactly the right people. It's part of the reason, although everyone wants to know about wage decisions, why I've not tended to use that part of the survey as much. I think the stuff we really care about is more likely to come out cleanly from the business survey. So that's why I've stuck there. So my answer, sorry, is a long one, Rangan, but I'm not sure that I have confidence in the labor part of that. We look at it because maybe there's information, but the fact that it does wild things sometimes, I'm not sure what to say about that.
Yeah, it's fine. We all know the kind of labor data we are dealing with, and with the unemployment figures coming out today, you take a survey today, you'll get a different answer again.
Precisely.
Gideon. Gideon, I'll give you the last question.
Okay, very quickly, I agree with Nicola here. So my main thing, if I had to explain a normal macroeconomic model, I would struggle to find a structural that captures an entire economic story very well. And if I have to explain what determines expectations, or what determines expectation disagreement, I have even less of a structural idea what should be in the model. So just a linear regression is perhaps a risky route, because all you pick up are some correlations that might mean almost anything. So here I would think of perhaps trying some other measures. Like Nicola said, these are their previous predictions. What I would particularly be interested in is, do people respond to their previous mistakes? So how far was I wrong last time? I guessed the inflation rate, and use that as a predictor. Do I discount my prediction, or does dispersion get larger if more people were wronger last time? Something like that, but real information updating, trying to build that in.
Yes, so you're suggesting that the degree to which they use the information to update how they update the information, their forecasts based on receiving new information about their errors.
Yeah. So if everyone was right last time, their dispersion and predictions should go down. If everyone was wrong last time, the dispersion and the predictions should go up. That sort of idea.
Right. Thanks, Gideon.
Or like Jenny showed yesterday, that the forecast error can remain very persistent and very, very slow learning. That would be a nice thing to get anyway.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Thank you.
That's great. Monique, thank you very much. That was great. Thank you.